Welcome back to Global Money Talk live from the New York Stock Exchange. Earnings season continues in earnest as we head into month end. Alphabet Class A shares initially rose after strong results driven by its cloud division. And in New York morning trade, we're seeing shares nearly flat on the session. Meanwhile, Meta Platforms shares declined while Microsoft stock increased after earnings reports, but is off about 5% in New York morning trade. Apple and Amazon will report earnings after the close. And this week, about a third of S&P 500 companies announcing results. Joining me this morning is Dan Hoff, partner at Karani Asset Management. Dan, good morning and thank you for joining me.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start out with a look at Google Class A shares, Alphabet shares. So what did you make of the results from the company?
Sure. So I was on the show recently talking about Google and Alphabet. By the way, I'll be using them interchangeably a lot. Of having a attractive risk reward for an investor. My view still is the same. I think the perception that there is in the marketplace that Google, that Alphabet is behind in AI, and how AI is going to be an existential threat to Google's search business. Those obviously those are issues. Those are risk factors. But I still think that the jury's still out, and that I think it's worth betting on that the fact that it's more likely than not, or my view is that it's more likely than not that they'll figure out AI over time. So I still think it's an attractive risk reward. If you look at literally the first paragraph of Google's earnings prepared remarks. The CEO of the company, the CEO of Alphabet, Sundar Pichai, basically highlighted three things as to why he thinks Google is going to, or Alphabet is going to be a winner in AI. First, they have the technical infrastructure. That's basically the hardware necessary to support the AI efforts. Second, a world-class research team. Google just had two of its researchers win a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Now, I realize that it's just two of very many that they have, but still, they still are doing a lot of the most sort of cutting-edge research in their areas. And third, the global reach that they have, the installed base, which I also talked about last time when I was on the show. So those three components really, they have what it takes to be successful in AI. And what they will have to do is really execute. If you think about they have 7 products that have over 2 billion monthly active users. Those products are all using Google's AI capabilities behind the scenes. Apparently more than a quarter of the new codes that they wrote was written by AI. Obviously, there was human involvement too, ultimately, but it was written by AI. So, the AI tools are also making Google's cloud better. The AI capabilities are making YouTube better recommendation, better tools for content creators and management of that content. Their AI capabilities also making Waymo better. And also just in terms of search, which some people think Gen AI presents a existential threat to, Google thinks AI actually supercharges their search business. Now you might say, well, what else are they going to say? Sure, they are talking their own book, if you will, but the search results, the improving search results, and sort of the improving monetization of the search business through the use of AI behind the scenes is something that could definitely be a positive for the company. So there's obviously, the perception, unfortunately, Google's, the rollout of the consumer-facing product. In the earlier days, there were obvious missteps that kind of gave this perception that Google is behind in AI. But like I said, I think the jury's still out. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that I think are quite promising. And given the three components that I mentioned, or that the CEO of Google mentioned, that I agree with, I think the chances are pretty good, pretty high, that they figure it out, and it really, at this point, I think, comes down to execution.
Yeah, so speaking of execution, Dan, so I think that was a good primer to what we're discussing, and perhaps when you look at an organization such as Alphabet or Google, you might just think of key products there, but they are leaders and very dominant in some of the categories that you mentioned. So can you walk us through how you expect the company to execute well?
Right. So my confidence, if you will, in Google's ability to execute, which, by the way, as is the case with everything I say, just because I'm confident doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? But the confidence that I have really comes from the confidence in the quality of the organization and the culture of that organization. Now, culture can be a controversial topic for Google. There are a lot of people who will tell you it's not what it used to be. Google has changed, the culture has changed, et cetera, et cetera. When I say that I have confidence in Google's culture, that they'll be able to execute, that they'll continue to innovate, and that they'll continue to be able to monetize their innovations, I'm not talking about the culture that took Google from 0 to 10 billion. I'm talking about the culture that that allowed Google to be successful from, say, 30 billion to 300 billion in revenues. So obviously, there's been changes at the company. I mean, as companies grow, cultures change. But just because culture has changed, just because it's not what it used to be, doesn't mean that it's no longer effective. It can still be plenty effective. And I think that's the culture necessary to take Google to the next level. You read media stories about how Google has changed, and some of these more visible missteps that are very public, that indicate that something might be broken at the company. Big part of our job as investors is to compare perception versus reality. And there's obviously this perception, but also the reality is, for instance, Google has won something like 16 consecutive years as best place to work, or one of the best places to work, by Glassdoor. It's something that its own employees vote to get you on that list. 16 years in a row, I don't think any other company actually has that record, or if they do, it's really very few. And just because it's a place where employees are happy to be, doesn't necessarily mean that it's innovative and strong on execution. It could very well mean that it's just a comfortable place for people to be. And trust me, we know several of those kinds of places too. But in the case of Google, people are still clearly satisfied, happy to be there. It's still attracting a lot of good people and capable people. And that is combined with, the innovation, the progress, and the results of the company. So, as I sit here, there is really no good reason, other than sort of a string of anecdotes, if you will, which, anecdotes, you do have to take it with a grain of salt. Other than a string of anecdotes, I see no good reason to conclude that something is, say, broken at Google. And our view is that, it's largely the same culture, like I said, the same culture that took the company from, say, 30 billion to 300 billion. Not the culture, the very early stage culture, but the more later stage culture that was still very effective and successful. We think that's largely intact, which is what we base our confidence on.
And with an organization such as Google, we think about the company when it first started decades ago, so it has been around for a while. And what takes an organization from startup to a mid-cap to a large cap, mega cap, there are so many different steps, layers, and especially when you go public on a major exchange, there are different obligations for a company,
right.
Shareholder obligations. But you mentioned corporate culture, and we know with an organization like Google, there have been stories about the company, what it's like to work at Google. A lot of young students aspire to work at Google, and even within Silicon Valley, each company has its own culture. And I understand this is very important for you at Karani Asset Management to look at corporate culture. So can you walk us through the why and what you actually look at?
Sure. So if we take a step back and think about, in the public markets, what causes big price moves? Big price moves are usually the result of surprises. So we're in the heart of earnings season right now. Big moves in stock prices in the near term. When do we get them? When a company reports better than expected results, price goes up. Sometimes it goes up a lot. When a company delivers worse than expected results, i.e. negative surprise, the price goes down a lot. That's in the short term. It also applies in the long term. A company that ends up over the next 5-10 years much better results than what the market had anticipated will end up delivering positive alpha, strong positive outperformance. When a company delivers results, a company that was expected to be, continue to do well and have a strong position in the market ends up disappointing on that, again, negative surprise, that's when you will have negative alpha. So in the public markets, big moves or alpha is usually the result of surprises. So at some point we sort of thought to ourselves, what if there's a way for us to sort of systematically capture these positive surprises and also systematically avoid negative surprises? And in thinking about that, we ultimately came to culture. We have a saying at our firm, at a company with a good corporate culture, what the world does not yet know is probably something good. At a company with a bad culture, what the world does not yet know is probably something bad. We as public market investors, we only find out about things that are happening at the company like after the fact, right? There are always things brewing at any given company. Sometimes it's a good surprise, sometimes it's a bad surprise. So by focusing on culture, we could actually construct a portfolio that is over-indexed to positive surprises, and therefore, by definition, less exposed to negative surprises. And we're in our business, we're all trying to predict the future, which is very difficult to do. People use different methods to try to predict the future. At our firm, what we're doing is, culture actually is, in our view, among the most durable aspects of a company. Product cycles change, or products change, people change, market environment changes, the economy changes, competitive landscape changes. Culture is among the most durable parts or aspect of a company. It usually doesn't change very quickly. It is possible for it to change quickly. There are examples of that. And sometimes culture can deteriorate really quickly. But unless management is really trying to destroy it, usually it moves pretty slowly. What that means is if you focus on culture, you could increase your chance of being right about predicting how a company will behave in the future and over the long term. So by focusing on that's why we focus on the culture. And another a great thing about the beauty of focusing on culture is something that we can study now. We're basically trying to understand the culture of the company, what the culture is today, and because it's slow to change, we can rely on what it is today, continuing to be true for over the long term. Again, no process that involves that's trying to predict the future is perfect. Every process will yield some false positives. I kind of compare picking methods to trying to predict the future to picking poison. So it is picking poison, but in our experience, in our view, focusing on the culture is among the best of the options available.
And when we have a discussion about corporate culture here in the U.S., it might be considered somewhat of a debate or a controversial topic because there are so many elements that go into corporate culture. And when we step back and look at some of the outcomes of the pandemic, we heard of new terms such as quiet quitting or quiet hiring, what was going on within organizations. Would these companies allow for remote work versus having to go in on a regular basis? And these are all the elements that go into making a corporate culture. And of course, in a country like the U.S., leadership and management make a big difference in direction for a company. So
Absolutely.
My question is, how do you actually measure corporate culture? How do you qualify or quantify an organization's corporate culture?
Sure. We get that question all the time. So first of all, culture isn't just one thing. We say that culture is the way things are done at a place, at a company. And it's not just at companies. If you think about our homes, there's a certain expectation of how things are done at your household, at my household. We don't, for instance, my kids know that we don't do certain things a certain way at the house. We all have that, and it's not written down anywhere, but they just know it because that's just how things are done. You could even look at it at a country level. I mean, we often say things like, that is not American. Like, that's just not what we do. Like, what does that mean? It's not necessarily written down somewhere. I mean, some of it is, in the Constitution and whatnot, but not everything is written down, but we all know what that means because that's just how things are done in this country. That's the standard, that's the expectation. At a company, again, these things aren't necessarily written down. But for instance, at my company, we all know how we're supposed to treat our clients. We all know how we're supposed to treat one another. We all know what kind of behavior will get one fired and what kind of behavior will get one promoted. And those sorts of things are true anywhere you go. So culture, ironically, it's very, in some sense, it's very clear, but it's also, because it's not just one thing, it's very difficult to quantify and measure. Having said that, the components that make up the culture, or the aspects of a company that tell you about the culture of that company, many of those are trackable, observable, and measurable. So, for example, in a manufacturing company, safety records is something that gets disclosed, and you can compare safety records to the industry, to the industry averages. A company that has terrible safety record and consistently bad safety record, you could assume that employees at that company probably aren't very engaged, because it's hard to have really engaged, happy, workforce at a company that doesn't care about employee safety. And the opposite is true. A company that really has strong and consistent safety history, you could assume that employees at that company know that management and the organization cares about employee safety. I'll give you some more examples. Atlas Copco is a company that my partner Richard mentioned recently when he was on the show. This company really values decentralization. They talk about how consultants will tell them that, or sometimes investors will tell them, hey, if you were more centralized, your operations would be a lot more efficient. You could get rid of redundant costs. It'll be much more efficiently run. But the company proudly talks about how their decentralization, even though it may cause the company to be less efficient, what they gain in return is speed and better information on the ground, and being able to act on that information with speed, which they are convinced and have demonstrated over a long period of time is actually a good trade-off. For a company like that, if we start to see that behavior change, for example, that'll be something that we would watch closely and would potentially be a red flag, because we know that the success of the company, a key factor in the long-run success of the company was that structure. So when that changes, say new CEO comes in and the first thing he or she does is, well, we're going to become more centralized. Like, that'll be a red flag, and that's something that we could observe. Hermes, company that I talked about at some point. It's a very conservatively run company throughout generations. The company has a corporate structure called partnership limited by shares in English. What that means is that it's kind of like America's limited partnership structure, where the limited partners have limited liability, but the general partner has unlimited liability. Partnership limited by shares is a structure where, for the management of those that run the business, the liabilities of the business they can have personal liability for the liabilities of the business. You could bet that when you run a business with that kind of structure, that you'll be very conservative in the way you run the business and the liabilities that the business takes on. If that structure changes and we start seeing the company be run more aggressively in terms of balance sheet and risk, that'll be something that'll be obvious that would be a red flag. Just a couple of more examples. Costco, I talked about at some point, right? Costco has a very clear limit on how much markup they put on top of their cost. For Costco, that is a brand promise, and that brand promise is very important. If we start seeing changes in that behavior, start seeing them have a lot more gross profit, which the market may welcome in the near term, but to us that would be a red flag, because that signals a change in behavior, a change in culture. And lastly, there's a company called NVR in the home building space. Been a very successful business and a stock for multiple decades. After going through a near-death experience, taking on balance sheet risk, because most home builders take on balance sheet risk by buying land. This company said, you know what, never again. A lot of companies will tell you never again, but you do have to watch them over time if they actually really stick with that. This company has demonstrated over multiple cycles that we're not taking on balance sheet risk. We're going to manage the business conservatively, and if something changes, shareholding or senior management, and if we start seeing them take on balance sheet risk, that'll be a red flag. So those things, the aspects of the business or of the company that tell you about the culture, and that they've demonstrated over a long period of time, those are things that we can continue to monitor, measure, and track to make sure that the culture remains intact. And just the last thing I'll just say about that is, often when we think about culture, people sometimes assume that we maybe we favor sort of smaller companies. Because usually, good corporate culture is associated with, family-like environment and sort of that small company vibes. But actually, we usually prefer companies that have been around for a long time. And usually, companies that have been around for a long time successfully tend to be larger. They usually don't remain small if they've been successful. And that's because we want to see, like I said, we want to see companies that have demonstrated these traits, these cultural traits over a long period of time, so that we can be sure, so that we can know where in the company's history that what the sources of the company's success has been over time. So that's why culture is really important to us. But obviously, we don't just look at culture. The obvious other aspect to consider is the strength of the business, which I'd be happy to talk more about.
Yes, I do want to ask you about that, Dan, but very quickly before we get to that, you said that corporate culture, especially for large, successful companies that have been around and has been time-tested, that the culture is usually very slow to change if it is going in a negative direction. How much does succession affect that?
Yes, so succession, part of the looking at culture, and we try to be data-driven, as data-driven as possible, because you could easily, fall for charming stories and, kind of sort of the more sort of qualitative aspects of a company's culture. And it could be a trap. So we're very focused on looking for evidence, quantifiable, trackable evidence when we evaluate culture. But that doesn't mean that our approach is just purely quantitative. There's science part. The measurement is science, but the application, applying that is an art. And the art part of what we do is there because you can't apply these things universally. So succession. In some companies, senior management change, or the founder retiring and sort of handing management off to professional management. For some companies, that could be a bad thing. For some companies, that could be a good thing. So you do have to know the context to know how you apply these different attributes or aspects of the corporate culture of the company. So there's not one way to answer how is succession important or not. It really depends, and I'm not avoiding the question because, like I said, in some cases, new management is a good thing. In some cases, it's a big challenge. But one thing I will say is we like seeing companies that are actually been around for a long period of time, that are actually on their third or fourth or fifth CEO, and that the company's culture remains intact, because that to us indicates that the culture at that point is really in the water of that company, if you will. It's really in the DNA. It's not being driven by just one person or just one generation of management. It's really part of the company at that point. And in that case, we could have more confidence, and succession is less of a risk in that context.
And finally, before we wrap it up, Dan, I do want to go into what else besides culture you look at when you're picking stocks.
Right. So like I said, the business obviously matters. When we say we're culture first, that's the most important thing. That's the first thing we look at. But obviously, you can't invest only based on culture. And like I said earlier, sometimes people assume that, oh, you must like smaller companies, because of this association of good corporate culture with sort of small company vibes and friendly culture and things like that. Actually, as an investment proposition, culture, we think, is more important for larger, more established companies than smaller companies. What we mean is, you could have the best group of people in the world come together and start a company, but if the product doesn't work, if the product fails, then the company fails. The company's over. Whereas at a large company, your product is definitely way beyond the proof of concept stage. And in fact, it's more likely than not, you're in a pretty solid position as a business. You're already pretty well established. At that point, what matters more often than not, is execution. It's making sure that you don't fall behind. It's not being complacent. It's staying on top of your game. It's continuously innovating. It's pressing on your advantages to continue to win. And that is cultural. So, culture matters, again, as an investment proposition, we think even more at larger, more established companies. So we look to those types of businesses or businesses in that area, and we care a lot about the strength of the business, therefore. Companies that are in a position where they don't have to take on a whole lot of business development risk, that they're not really trying to bring a brand new product to the market, but are already in a solid position and are in a position or in a phase of their cycle where they have to where they're really pressing on their advantages to continue to win. So, companies that have, high switching costs, companies that are selling essentials, companies that are conservatively managed, those are good places to be in. And when you combine that with a strong, winning, effective corporate culture, we think that's a good combination.
Well, Dan, we are out of time for today, but thank you so much for such a thorough discussion on the various moving parts when it comes to corporate culture.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that will do it for Global Money Talk live from the New York Stock Exchange. We're so excited to bring you daily coverage here on Sampro TV. You can check out the show anytime on our YouTube channel by searching Global Money Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back here tomorrow morning. Have a great day.